Hello, I'm Laura Guyers-Burke, Project Officer for the Australian National University's Child and Adolescent Trauma, Loss and Grief Network, or CATLN for short. Today I'm joined by my colleagues Nicola Palfrey, Director of CATLN and Clinical Psychologist.
Hello.
And Dr. Margaret Nixon, Senior Researcher who's worked as an educator for many years.
Hello.
Hi. In the spirit of reconciliation, CATLN acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respect to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. So ladies, it's no secret that communities around Australia are experiencing some of the most challenging times in recent memory. School staff have been under unprecedented pressure this year to support their students and their families. Many have had to cope with disasters in their own communities, and now all have been impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. Schools have had to adapt in a manner of days to new modes of delivery, and online learning has become the new normal. With now a staged return to face-to-face schooling, adding even more complexity to the mix. We'll jump right in. Margaret, what practical advice do you have for educators and other school staff on how to best support children in these challenging times?
Thanks, Laura. Yeah, I think as you say, it has been incredibly challenging. There have been so many shifts in what is normal and the way that we're working. But I think one thing to really start with, and I'd like to preface this whole webinar, is that there are some things that have stayed the same. As teachers, you still have great relationships with your students. You still have that enormous bank of teaching resources and practice and knowledge that you draw on every day. You still have relationships. You know your families in the school environment that you work in. And you've also got that enormous resource of colleagues in your current schools and networks. As teachers, we are great at networking, we're great at sharing good practice. So just as we go into, yes, of course things have changed, but there are also things that have stayed the same. And I think as we move into this webinar, we want you to hold on to that, but we also acknowledge that each of you will be going back to a different school environment, large ones, small ones, rural, high vulnerable families. It is just so complex. And so we're wanting you to listen to the things that, you know, the examples we might give, see how they resonate with you, with your cohort of students, with your school and your community. But also, hopefully it'll be a time for you to go, oh yeah, I remember I didn't do that, but I used to do this. So it will bring to mind your really good knowledge.
I think that's really great advice to start off with, Margaret. Thank you for that. The next question, so as teachers are juggling the return to the classroom, which may look very different from one school to another, what are some of the ways that they can create an environment that's going to best support learning to take place?
Yeah, we all know that a calm environment, a settled classroom are the things that really promote learning. And that is a juggle as we have movement backwards and forwards, remote learning back in classroom. Let's draw back to the things that are important and that we can maintain whether we're online or whether we have the children face to face. And that is remembering flexibility, boundaries, humour. They're great ways of being able to establish this. Also, just as teachers remembering that some things haven't changed, reminding the children that yes, there are differences, but there are also things that have stayed the same. Revisiting those routines, making sure kids are really clear around what's coming up, what's going to be planned. With the junior school, obviously we often use pictures to be able to say what's coming up over the week, what's going to be happening on that particular day. With older students, timetables, having a clear map for the day is a really good way of helping those kids that are feeling really anxious about, I don't know what's next, where am I meant to be? The other thing that can be a really good chance to involve kids in is to revisit those expectations you have in your own classroom and work with the students to say, do these still hold? What's still important to you? And really bringing them in and involving your students as you create a new way, but a way that still embraces what is important to them and what's important to a good learning environment. I think also remembering those special things, often we get really overwhelmed, but those special things like, do you have particular celebrations in your classroom? Do you have, your Friday afternoon where kids, get to pick an activity? Or do you have a celebration for birthdays or special days? What are the little rituals that you have, and can you re-establish those? Maybe you've kept them going, and congratulations for keeping them going as you move backwards and forwards. So those little things will remind kids around what's the same. And if you're changing them, then bring kids in so that they feel like they have some control over how their environment might look. And I suppose the last thing I'd just like to talk about very briefly is checking in with your kids. Things like circle time. It's a great chance not only to hear what's going on, what's important for the kids, but for you as a teacher to really be able to observe, are there any changes? Can you see that someone who normally would be really open and quick to involve and respond in something like circle time is being a bit more withdrawn, and maybe checking in with that child later on? Or it's a good chance for you just to be observant as well as listening.
Thanks, Margaret. Nicola, do you want to maybe expand on some of what Margaret was talking about rituals and sort of resuming practices of the celebrations and things? Is that also applicable in the later years of primary school as well?
Yeah, I think so. I think one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is some of the kids in the senior year. So thinking about year 6 students, for example. Year 6 is a year that kids really look forward to for those key markers in their education. They get to be the head of the school. They get to often have extra responsibilities. They get to be big buddies or have lead assemblies and those sorts of things. So there'll be a lot of things that kids may be worried that they're going to miss out on. So having a chat to them about what they might be concerned about, or how the school's going to modify those, get the kids' involvement. Certainly by years 5 and 6 all the way through, you want to include kids, but they will certainly have lots of ideas about how they might be able to reinvent them in these times, and that gives them some agency. But acknowledging that we know how to do this. We've kind of returned to school many times before. This is unusual because we've done it a couple of times already, and it's still looking differently. So acknowledging what has changed, what's been lost, and working with kids to find resolutions to it, I think is important.
Thank you. The next question, we have heard lots of questions about how educators can manage anxiety in students. Can you both comment on some strategies for this? And maybe we'll go back to Margaret. I wonder if you can touch on it from a perspective of assessment and learning.
Yeah, there's been a lot in the media. We've heard parents calling, we've heard teachers talking. There is a lot of anxiety around the thought that children are going to miss out, that they won't, and as teachers, the anxiety around, how will I get through the assessment, those sorts of things is really high in people's minds. Just remembering again that this is something that's not just occurring in your school or your community. This is a worldwide epidemic that is impacting education right across the board. And I think one of the things that can really hold us is making sure that we have a clear understanding of what is the state, what is your school's view on this, and being clear about that. How is the education department making decisions around what transition from primary school to high school will look like? What are the sort of assessments, so that you make sure that you've really got clear information about this and keep talking. Sorry, I'll just go back. that clear information is also really important to be able to pass on to parents, to say, we are aware of this, we have a handle on this, and here is what is happening, because that clarity will really help to reduce that anxiety that their child will be left behind, will have a bad report, will not meet expectations. So that's one thing that I would really encourage teachers to make sure that they are clear, and to work with your school and the state education department to make sure that everybody is on the same page and clear of expectations.
Thanks, Margaret. I think that's a really important point that you made, that everyone is experiencing the same thing right now. And I know we've all heard the phrase, we're all in this together, and we're probably getting a little sick of it by now, but I think it's really important to remember, particularly in the education setting, where the term falling behind implies that everyone, you know, you're falling behind a certain standard, but everyone is behind. And I think that's a really important point that you made there. Nicola, would there be any strategies that you'd like to suggest in this setting?
Well, I think that educators are going to be handling a range of anxiety. So there's a kind of performance or academic concerns that Margaret alluded to. There's also going to most likely be some quite significant issues around anxiety to do with separation anxiety in children and parents, and also around illness and getting sick. You know, people will be worried about, we're in the middle of a pandemic, what's going to happen? So educators, as Margaret said at the beginning, are very well versed in managing this. So every year, every term, they go through this in terms of managing children's return to school or starting of school, and they're going to need to draw on those strategies again, recognizing that they might have their own anxieties, their own children going back to school, or them being exposed to, you know, all of these new kids coming back in. So there's a real balancing act of educators have to be aware of their own state of mind. What position are they in? How are they feeling about it? Are they feeling supported? What are the strategies that they have in place to support everybody's health and well-being? But I think, again, communicating with parents. I've had some conversations this week with some parents of kindy kids about the return to school, and there is quite a lot of anxiety about it, because we have to remember that some of those the littlies have only had 8 weeks perhaps in preschool, or 8 weeks in kindy before, well, variable in the States, but, you know, not very long before they were back home, and some of them will not want to go back, and parents might be dreading they've kind of got through that first bump of separation, and that could be at any year. We all know that some kids struggle at different periods. So, but we have to, the other side of that is we got through that. And what are the strategies we can draw on that worked last time, the positive reinforcement? We might need to use that flexibility that Margaret spoke about. Kids might not be able to go back and tolerate a full day. So educators working with parents around the difficulty we have is it's a second return, and things aren't certain yet. So there's some certainty, but still not a lot. So work with the certainty we have, that your teacher is still the same, or the front office lady's friendly face is still there, and working with kids about those positives. But we do need to recognise there's still a huge amount of uncertainty, particularly if kids are coming 1 or 2 days a week and then home other days. There's still a lot to manage for all families. So we might not get back to full days, easy drop-offs as early as we would in other situations where it's more stable. And I think around the health concerns and health anxiety, I think we need to continue, even though, again, as you said, Laura, there's been lots of messaging. We still have to keep reminding kids, particularly now we're coming back together, around hygiene. Kids don't social distance very well, physically distance very well. Someone mentioned the other day, actually, which I hadn't thought of, was we're not doing it at home. We're all at home with our kids or with our relatives and so forth, and we don't think about it because we've been confined. So children haven't been thinking about it. So we're going to have to give them explicit messages about that, how they can greet people and play and be mindful of that, but also, you know, and I know schools are doing a lot about that, washing hands and all those things. So giving information, giving age-appropriate factual information about transmission of COVID, how many cases there are as you move up through primary school. You can work that factual information into classroom activities. The more kids know the right information, you can drop some of that anxiety.
Thanks, Nicola. I think that's really helpful. We'll keep it with you, Nicola. How might educators know that children might need extra support during these times? What should they be looking out for?
Yeah, I think, so this is often a concern, you know, normal, what's normal worry, or what's normal sadness, or agitation, those sorts of things, and when is it really time to pull in extra supports. Again, educators go through this a lot. Educators went through this, particularly those across New South Wales who were in bushfire impacted areas, had a lot of kids coming back at the beginning of this year who had heightened anxiety, or some of the symptoms maybe from having such a scary summer. So you're going to have a lot of kids who are a bit on edge. You're going to have a lot of kids that may be difficult to settle, or may be concerned about being away from mum or dad. And I think one of the things, when to get extra help, it doesn't hurt to ask, doesn't hurt to check in. Communication with parents will be really important. How are they travelling at home? If you're concerned, look to your supports within the school. So maybe get in another educator to seek their advice. If you have access to a school psychologist or other pastoral care, maybe keeping an eye on a child, trying to get some extra time to chat to them, or bring in somebody else to have a look and see what they think. But you can be cautious without being overly hysterical, I suppose. There's going to be some fractiousness and so forth. But keeping an eye on a child, ask them how they're going, how are they feeling. We've got to teach kids strategies for managing this. And with the anxiety that we're just talking about, there's an overall level of anxiety across the world. So making special attention, perhaps, or more focused attention on social emotional well-being and skills to manage anxiety. So they might be things like mindfulness, but also we always think about the down regulating ones like mindfulness or deep breathing. It's good to have some up ones as well, so to kind of get rid of some of that energy. So go noodle or other activities that people can kind of jump around and expend some of that nervous energy. So getting that into the classroom. And then if you see the kids that's not working on, you've got to try a few different things, but that might be a flag. So if you notice that most kids settle down a little bit after some of those activities, but some kids it's not really cutting the mustard, that might be an indication that they might need some additional support. So use your in-school supports, talk to families, and then recommend if they're struggling that they reach out for some extra support. GP is always a really good place to start.
That's great advice, Nicola. Margaret, is there anything you'd like to add to that, perhaps from your speaking from experience as an educator, of how to look out for kids who are needing extra support?
Yeah, I think that, as I mentioned earlier, the changing in behaviour, the change in response, the change in tolerance of kids, that might be how they're settling, it might be the way that they're approaching a task. How are they interacting with their peers? Are they withdrawing? Are they mixing with the same group? And I think that it's a great chance to start to really check in and to use that contact that you have with them, and also the knowledge that you already have around their families. So you might recognize that there are vulnerable families already, and just making sure that you're keeping an eye out for those students. But certainly the changes in not just behavior as in with peers and how they're getting on, how are they working within groups? If you are doing anything where kids are needing to, and even social distancing, but still within a group project, for example, how are they interacting with others? How tolerant are they being? Are they being forthcoming? Are they being, can you notice that there's a change in what you have seen before that would sort of indicate I might need to check in? And, as Nicola said, it might just be a matter of checking in with, hey, what's happening? I've noticed this. And start with that, and then allowing the child to talk with you about, what might be going on for them.
Thanks, Margaret. So it sounds like drawing on those existing relationships with your students is really particularly important there. Thank you both, Nicola and Margaret, for your time today. Are there any final points you'd like to make before we wrap things up?
I would just like to really cover a little bit more around staff wellbeing, taking care of yourself, thinking about yourself. And sometimes we're great at this and sometimes we're not. As Nicola said, where as staff we're impacted, by what's going on. We have our own family concerns, our own health concerns. We might be caring for extended family. We might be missing family. A whole lot of things going on for us as educators. And then we bring that into all of our concerns in going backwards and forwards, the expectations we put on ourselves as teachers. So I would just really encourage you to check in with yourself. Make sure that you draw on those colleagues or close friends that can also give you some feedback about, you know, chatting with them or asking them, you know, I'm just feeling like this, or I think I'm a bit this, or whatever. But also really to, you have links within your schools where you can be able to get some support. So if you have those, use those, whether they're formal or informal links, or support systems in your school, but also making sure you have some downtime. And that's part of a boundary that has been quite difficult with the online, making sure there's a boundary where you say, I have done my work today. The computer is going off. I am going to do something outside of school. And really setting those clearly, flexibly, with compassion and what's appropriate, but setting those boundaries to make sure that you actually have some time that you get to spend and be re-nourished and ready to go back in to do the great work that you do always.
Thanks, Margaret. I think that's a really good point. As everyone can see, we're all working in our homes today, and I think particularly in education setting where your work comes home with you a lot of the time, it is important to draw those boundaries for your own self-care and make sure that you're taking time for yourself as well. Nicola, is there anything else you'd like to say in closing?
Just one really quick thing. It's just reminding me as Margaret was chatting then that everyone that's going back into the school environment, educators, students, families, will have had a different experience over the last few months, and we can't assume what that is. And even within the same families, it will be different. I made the mistake the other day of saying to a parent, oh, you must be looking forward to the kids going back to school, and no, not at all. Mum was really anxious about the kids going back to school. They'd had a really rough start to the year. She was really enjoying having her kids at home. So we can't assume. So some kids will be busting through the school doors, can't wait to get back in there. Others will be full of dread, and so will the parents, and so will the teachers. So we have to be open to having those conversations. That's really important with kids, letting everybody know that not everybody's feeling the same way, and building up their empathy and compassion, that we're all going to take a little bit of a time to readjust. So that's at all levels, for kids, for educators, for families, that, you know, look after each other, because this isn't straightforward for anybody.
I think that's a great point to end on. Thank you, Nicola and Margaret, again, and thank you for everyone watching today. That's all we've got time for. We acknowledge again that it is a particularly challenging time for you all as educators, but we hope you found this video useful. We'd like to acknowledge the support from the New South Wales Department of Education in producing this video. Please take a minute to give us some feedback via our short survey, which will come up after the end of this video. And if you have any additional feedback, please don't hesitate to email us at earlytraumagrief@anu.edu.au. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.